what would you do if you had wandered into a canyon known for phantoms that appear out of nowhere, dog people that supposedly live and hide underground and eat people, and bizarre UFO and light anomalies, amongst other mysterious creatures? Well, there's a place like that, and it's called Fraser Canyon. Indigenous people have been warning about it for centuries, and I will share this accursed place's history, stories, and legends in today's episode, so let's get into it. In 1961, this article in Fate magazine called Phantom of the Caribou Trail told a pretty odd story set during the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush right around 1858 to 1860, and the Caribou Gold Rush in 1861. So imagine this, over 10,000 miners and many other folks just flooding the area, like totally desperate to find gold and make their dreams come true. So the British Army's Royal Engineers, being as cool as they were, actually built this crazy dangerous wagon trail along these insane mountain cliffs, and they called it the Caribou Road. One of the very first prospectors to embark on this really sketchy journey was a man by the name of John Fillmore. Now listen to this. During the summer of 1861, Fillmore was navigating the Caribou Road with 50 pack mules loaded with supplies for all of these miners out there. These guys were camped out near the spot called Spencer's Bridge, and that's when weird stuff really started to happen. Now, this article claims that this very bizarre white light just appeared in the sky at night when everybody was sleeping, except for the guard they set up. It was moving back and forth like it was searching for something, and then mysteriously, just vanished. The guard didn't report anything else strange that night, but when morning came, well, 3 of their mules were straight up gone as they had just vanished into thin air. Another prospector named George Lateau made camp near Yale when he too witnessed these strange, weird-looking lights that seemed to dance in a half circle above him, disappearing into the night. Now, just like Fillmore, the very next morning, Lateau woke up to find that 3 of his pack mules had vanished without a trace as well. So was this the work of some strange force that had taken Fillmore's animals? Now, it wasn't long before word had spread and the tale of the so-called Caribou Phantom started to emerge among the miners in the area, with hushed whispers of even more people who had gone missing in similar strange circumstances. Now, some people were convinced that this Caribou Phantom was the work of restless spirits, bizarre creatures from another world, or maybe even demons lurking in the shadows. But of course, others were skeptical. I mean, they believed it was probably just vivid imaginations playing tricks on these miners, or even the work of a cunning group of bandits preying on the unsuspecting travelers. And so at one point, this group of determined locals got together and formed a posse with one goal in mind. They would go out and find the truth behind these mysterious disappearances once and for all. Now, the night this posse made camp along the trail, all men had little sleep. They were on high alert because these white lights started moving above them, just like in previous stories. But other than that, nothing else really stood out as unusual. At least not according to the guards that were keeping a close eye out for any signs of danger. And when morning came, it seemed like the Caribou Phantom had struck again. 3 more mules were missing, just vanished without a trace. And so another attempt to capture this phantom had come up empty. So what exactly was going on here? Are we talking about ghosts, phantoms, and UFOs, or is this simply a product of some creative journalism that was so common back then? No, it's hard to say for sure, but one thing is certain, this isn't the only case of bizarre occurrences in the Fraser Canyon. Now, similar to these men's accounts of what they would describe as a phantom, a man by the name of Peter Santoro would describe his horrifying account with some sort of similar entity. Now, Peter had been a resident of Fraser Canyon since he was a child. The place had always been a hotbed for strange occurrences and unexplainable phenomena. As a paranormal researcher and ufologist, he had spent countless hours investigating these mysteries, but nothing could have prepared him for what would have happened. Now, as Peter was settling into bed for the night, he heard a strange noise that he couldn't quite discern. Now, he would describe it like a soft, rhythmic tapping, kind of like claws hitting wood. Now, he simply dismissed it as one of his dogs wandering around the house, but when he turned to face the sound, he was met with the sight that will forever scar him, because standing in the corner of his room was an entity unlike anything he'd ever seen. Now, he described it as humanoid in shape, but its features were far from human. He described it having skin that was sickly green, and it had these scales that almost seemed to shimmer in the reflection of light. He described a pair of small horns protruding from its head and a face that was a grotesque mix of insect and demon. He described its eyes glowing like this almost Christmas light red, were his words. And the teeth he described were almost fish-like but looked metallic. To further add to the strange horror, this being also was adorned in a black uniform of sorts with a symbol that Peter couldn't recognize. This thing held a strange object in its hand resembling a wand or a pen. Its other hand ended in a sharp single claw, but what struck Peter the most was its expression. It was grinning this wicked, evil grin that completely paralyzed Peter. Now, Peter describes he tried to scream out for help, but nothing came out. He was unable to move anything out of his entire body. Now, the more and more terrified Peter visibly became, this thing seemed to really enjoy it, like it was getting off on him being absolutely terrified, completely demonic in nature. This thing began to step towards Peter, and that's when he described that everything just completely whited out. Now, eventually Peter came to, and he was all alone in his room. The only evidence of it ever being in the room were these strange markings on his skin that he described looked like large claw marks. After that night, he had troubles sleeping for God knows how many weeks after, and he always felt a weird connection to the mirror in his room. Maybe connection isn't the word, but maybe had a strange feeling about it, so much so there was so much negativity around it, he actually had to physically remove the mirror from his room. In the weeks that would transpire, Peter was plagued with horrific nightmares, sleepless nights, and what he would describe as horrific and bizarre heart palpitations. He feels that whatever this entity was had marked Peter in some way and did something to him internally, but he can't say what. All he can do is just live with this experience. What do you guys think of Peter's story? Now, let me introduce you to another individual, a Scots-Canadian anthropologist by the name of James Tate. Now, this guy spent years living among and researching the indigenous Thompson tribe in this same area and uncovered quite a few bone-chilling tales and mysterious creatures right around these parts. Now, one such story that he had come across talked about this race of dog people that, get this, supposedly live underground in a complex network of tunnels not too far from a Thompson Indian village called Spuzzum, and it's right there at the lower end of the Fraser Canyon. Now, Tate shares this eerie description of these dog people. The dog people lived in an underground lodge near Spuzzum. Now, their house was called the Caxielix and had a false door. So strangers, upon entering and when about to leave the bottom of the ladder to step on the floor, would tumble down into a pit of great depth, where they were killed and eaten by the dog people, who would never come forward except for night. I mean, can you imagine? It's like something straight out of a horror movie. And it makes you wonder what other strange and terrifying secrets are hiding deep within the Fraser Canyon. The world is always weird, and sometimes the line between reality and fiction is thinner than we might think. Now, there are more horrors than just dog people. There's also this terrifying tale about a race of giants that supposedly used to wander the land. The Thompson people mention that these beings were once pretty standard, but around the 1850s and 60s, they just disappeared right when the Fraser Canyon gold rush happened. Imagine that. Now, these giants were massive, standing at a freakishly 30 feet tall. This is not even 30 feet. They would drape themselves in animal skins and holes in caves hidden behind cliffs. They only came down when they needed to hunt for food, and they would do so by running in massive strides, their hands reaching out to strangle their prey with their crazy strength. You would think that animals that large would be easy to spot. Well, the thing is, they had a way of hiding. But even if you couldn't see them, these giants had this smell about them. It was a pungent scent that can make your stomach turn. It was said to linger in the air for miles around. In fact, Tate described these giants in his writings like this. According to the beliefs of the Upper Thompsons, giants about 30 feet tall inhabit the Okanagan country and were numerous in the Upper Thompson until the 1850s and 60s. The Lower Thompsons believe that these giants do not live in their own country, but come down occasionally from that of the Okanagan and Upper Thompsons. Now check out what they said the giants could do. They could carry a grizzly bear or an elk on their backs with the greatest ease. The smallest of these creatures is 4 or 5 times the height and strength of an ordinary man, while the largest is only comparable to trees. They can carry 4 large buck deer on their backs at one time with the greatest ease, and it is said that one of them killed 2 black bears and shoved them one into each side of his belt, as an ordinary man would do with 2 squirrels. Yikes, I would not want to encounter that. Now, humanoid giants aren't the only giant creatures said to inhabit the canyon, because back in 2005, a 21-year-old man named Raymond had a terrifying encounter of his own. Now, in 2005, Raymond was a 21-year-old man working at a remote logging camp in the Fraser Canyon in British Columbia. The camp was a rugged, self-sufficient community of about 20 or so men nestled in the heart of the Canadian wilderness. They were a motley crew of lumberjacks, cooks, mechanics, and others who would keep the camp running. And their days were filled with hard work, and their nights were spent around the campfire, just settling down, de-stemming from the day under the sky. Now, this camp in particular was located near the edge of the dense forest, with the mighty Fraser River flowing nearby. Now, where they were miles away from the nearest town, and their only connection to the outside world was a single unreliable radio. It was a harsh, isolated existence, but they were a rather tight-knit group and they looked out for each other. Now, it was one evening when Raymond was on firewood duty, because he had always enjoyed this task as it allowed him to be alone with his thoughts and the serene beauty of the wilderness. However, that night, as he was chopping wood near the edge of the camp, he noticed something very unusual up on the ridgeline about 200 yards away. It was a massive, oversized silhouette, much larger than any animal he had ever seen. Now, as Raymond squinted to get a better look, he realized that it was a bird perched on a large boulder. But this was no ordinary bird. I mean, it was enormous, easily over 7 feet tall, its form outlined against the fading night. It was still almost statuesque, as if surveying the landscape below. Its feathers were shimmering in the dying light, reflecting hues of pink, gold, and red. Now, Raymond, of course, was incredibly awestruck by this sight, and he had heard stories of the Thunderbird. Now, this was a legendary indigenous creature that was said to bring with it bad omens like storms, among a host of other things. But he claimed that as he sat there looking at this thing, he just felt this strange calm wash over him, as if this being realized he was down there and this thing was comforting him, or so he described. Now, what he describes next would take his breath away. He would see it open its wingspan and take off into the night so quickly and completely vanish that he would describe its appearance as completely awe-inspiring and breathtaking. Now, Raymond would actually go and share this experience with a few indigenous elders who would occasionally come and visit their camp. Now, after talking with a few of the elders, they would confirm that yes, he did indeed see a Thunderbird, which is supposedly a powerful spirit creature rarely if ever seen by humans. Raymond considers himself extremely fortunate to witness such a spectacle. I mean, it's not often that people see things like that. He describes it as a profound connection with the supernatural world. Now, only a year later in the winter of 2006, he had another encounter which which would further cement his belief in the supernatural. This time, it was a particularly harsh winter, and the camp was blanketed with snow. The days were short, the nights were long, and the biting cold often kept them trying to keep everything as warm as possible. Now, one evening, after working a very long day, Raymond decided to walk along the riverbank. As the night was young, the moon was full, and it was kind of one of those nights where the moon was out and it was so bright that it actually illuminated everything. And so Raymond stops and notices this pulsating white light on a different ridge out in the distance, and he swears he could see it flying with wings off in a different direction, and realizes that it's the same figure he saw the year prior. And as it was flying off from the ridge, it would change in different hues from white to blue to green, almost in otherworldly shades and hues of color. He could vividly recall that the feathers almost had this ethereal glow or light to them, and that the sighting was so awe-inspiring it caused him to stand there right in the spot, transfixed on this entity with wings clearly disappearing from view in the night sky, because when you see something like that with the darkness all around you, there ain't no way that that's not gonna stand out. Of course, he didn't tell anybody else who he worked with, and he's not sure if he's the only one who's seen this thing, but Raymond likes to believe that he's one of the few that has gotten a glance of the supernatural realm, and that seeing this entity 2 separate times is a sign of great significance. Now, a Bailey Myers also experienced something she could not explain in 2001 while camping right around the Nahatlatch River. The incident appeared in Fraser Canyon at the farthest reaches of the Nahatlatch River campground at campsite number 7. And so Bailey ensured they got the most remote spot where one could dump camp. Bailey wanted solitude away from the hustle and bustle, so it was quiet and rather lonely, surrounded by the serenity of the forest. Now, around 3 in the morning, just like that, Bailey wakes up, she turns to her husband and asks him what was wrong, because she could sense there was clearly something going on, and he was frightened. So when Bailey was pressing and asking why, he kept claiming he heard a strange noise from the forest. Now, usually, Bailey would just tell him to go back to sleep, like a traditional response, but she could sense that something was different, and almost instantaneously, a chorus of owls began hooting one after the other non-stop. Then the coyotes joined in, and with their eerie howls, every bird in the vicinity woke up and joined in the cacophony. And this went on for about an entire minute. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped, and Bailey knew this was not normal. And then they heard it. Thud, thud, thud. Branches were snapping, wood was cracking with each step, and Bailey began thinking, okay, that's a biped, but a human, unless they were trying to scare them, wouldn't be stomping around like that. An adult would know better, knowing that people might be armed. Besides, the terrain needed to be more treacherous for a casual nighttime stroll, with no guarantee of encountering someone to frighten. Now, during the day, the forest was too dense for hunting, and Bailey knew there were no bears. It wasn't a deer or any other familiar woodland creature, but whatever it was kept getting closer and closer. So Bailey knew that she should cough loudly just to see if whoever it was out there would realize, hey, we hear you. Whatever it was kept going. And she noted the steps as heavy and laborious, full of grunts, and these steps were very loud. So now Bailey gets up, knowing the flashlight was left in their truck, so she runs out there, she's rummaging around for it, looking for it, and there, right there in the glove box, she finds the flashlight, she's scanning around, she's looking for whatever is making this noise, and as soon as she starts scanning her surroundings, it stops. Everything becomes quiet around them. Now Bailey begins to start the vehicle and points the headlights towards the woods. And they put the high beams on, right? So it is shining really bright. She's looking for any signs of movement. She's trying to be as quiet as possible. She sees nothing. Now she notices something else immediately, that the forest around them is dead quiet. And you could hear a pin drop. She feels the prickles of nervousness and fear all over her body. Something is very wrong. And then cutting through the silence like a knife through butter, she hears this loud, this exhale that was deeper than she had ever heard. She described it like a sigh of an elephant or a boar in a man, something that she could not explain. And with that, she runs back in the tent, leaving the cairn with the high beams facing the forest where the noise was coming from. And so it's safe to say that Bailey and her husband didn't get much sleep that night at all. And in fact, a few hours later, in the middle of the night, they convinced themselves just to get up, run in the truck, drive off, and they would return back in the morning for their tent and supplies. Now, is it possible at all that the giants that's described in the Fraser Canyon actually might be more akin to hairy beasts like Bigfoot? In fact, there is a very specific chief by the name of Chief Dick, who was a Thompson elder, and apparently he was deep in a hunting trip in the woods on the mountains east of Spuzzum when he saw something strange he could not account for. The village elder, Annie York, gave an account, and it reads this: Chief Dick's eyesight was unfailing, his nerves were solid as a boulder, and he wasn't a man given to imagination. The animal, human, or whatever it was, appeared to sense the hunter's presence. This did little to pacify his fears, and for full minutes, Chief Dick prayed and pondered whether to retreat or shoot. Despite his great anxiety and agitation, he noted that the other being resembled a human or man with generally gray medium hair, covering it from head to feet and displaying massive width of shoulders with long, powerful arms. The face, he states, was hairy and wide, and the eyes piercing and searching in their probing efforts to locate his position. A slight movement on the part of the hunter climaxed the suspense, and as Chief Dick watched as he never had before, the great creature faded silently from sight and was soon lost among the shadows of the timber. Now, the legend goes that Chief Dick had went and gathered a hunting party and then would later return to the scene, and this is supposedly where they would find gigantic footprints, and get this, they would describe it as nearly twice the size of their own. Now, what's very interesting is a reverend by the name of John Boothgood, who was a missionary, would also write about such tales and claims, and he too had heard many of these stories during his time in the Fraser Canyon, which was right around 1866 to 1882. And he would write this: on 3 different occasions in successive years, and in entirely different points of observation, the most startling reports were circulated far and wide that when camping out for purposes of hunting, fishing, gathering wood and berries, certain of our Indians had been visited in the dead of night by something that seemed half man, half beast, which had come into the tents while sleeping or prowled around their encampment, producing the greatest consternation and amazement. The idea prevailed that certain wild men of the woods were at large in the less frequented parts of the country and were exceedingly dangerous and might one day invade settlements. Now, it's probably no surprise to a lot of you that this whole area, Fraser Canyon, has been a hotbed of Sasquatch and Bigfoot sightings and reports. So could these writings be alluding to that? Now, what's really interesting is, in addition to all these strange creatures and phantoms, including giants, there were also supposedly dwarves that lived in this canyon. And in fact, going back to Tate for a second, he would even write about it. And he would say this: they are just like men, but their skins are pale and their bodies are very gaunt. They are only about 2 feet tall. They wander around the mountains, sometimes shouting, groaning, or weeping. Their eyes are sunk very deep into their heads. They run away from hunters and go into inaccessible places. The lower Thompsons say they can make themselves visible or invisible at will. According to their ideas, dwarf women do not exceed 3 feet in height. However, a few of the men are tall, surpassing the tallest Indians in stature, but none are of medium size. All wear clothes similar to those formerly worn by the Indians, but have never been seen with bows and arrows. They are rather fond of joking and playing tricks on people. Also, regarding these strange pale entities lurking about, they are the same size and height as ordinary people, but naked, and of ghost color. They are gaunt, the shape of all their bones and joints visible. Their eyes are huge and round and protrude from their heads. Like ghosts, they chase people but are more persistent. Another creature is a human body of white color, without any limbs, which occasionally rolls over the ground, uttering cries like an infant. A person who sees any of these monsters will die shortly afterward. Now, my thoughts revolve around the time frame this information was being written. If this was all a hoax and was faked, why. Now, indeed, these men truly encountered and saw things that, by our natural laws of nature, shouldn't exist. Is it possible there could be portals that lead to other dimensions in this very canyon? Well, a fascinating letter surfaced that would describe what a man by the name of Robert would witness, a ritual being performed that opened up portals of beings coming out into the open. I bear witness to the following account shared with me by Robert Y., a Fraser Canyon, British Columbia resident. Robert, a retired logger, had lived in the area since 1985. He was a man of few words, but his words carried weight when he spoke. I met Robert during a community meeting in 2007 where he shared this chilling account with me. I was a minister in Vancouver for a decade and have been a history teacher for 20 years. I have also been involved in campaigns against child labor, sweatshops, modern-day slavery, and genocide in Sudan. I have also written several books. One evening, as we sat by a campfire near his cabin, Robert pointed towards the dense forest and said, "There's something not right about this place. I've seen things I can't explain." His voice was steady, but his eyes held a haunted look. He described an event that took place in the summer of 1985. He had returned home late from work when he stumbled upon a clearing in the woods. In the clearing, he saw a group of people cloaked in black gathered around a large stone. They were chanting in a language he couldn't understand. Then suddenly, the air around them started to shimmer and several portals opened up. From these portals, demonic beings emerged, their forms grotesque and terrifying. The beings moved around the clearing, their movements were unnatural and jerky. Robert described the creatures in vivid detail. They had elongated bodies, their skin a sickly green hue. Their eyes glowed red in the dim light and they had sharp, jagged teeth. He could see the fear in the eyes of the people in the clearing as they continued their ritual, seemingly unable to stop. Robert was frozen in fear, unable to move or look away. He felt a cold dread seeping into his bones as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't know how long he stood there watching the horrifying spectacle, but the sun was starting to rise when he finally managed to tear his gaze away and run. Robert's voice was steady when he shared his story with me, but his hands trembled slightly. He had lived in Fraser Canyon all his life and heard stories of strange occurrences, but he had never experienced anything like this. He believed Fraser Canyon was a hot spot for paranormal activity, and his experience confirmed this. I share this story hoping that someone reading it who has witnessed similar events in Fraser Canyon might come forward and clarify what happened that night. Then in 1990, an anonymous man and his son encountered what they believe was an unknown alpha predator. The father and his son had been hunting in Fraser Canyon for years, and it was their tradition, their bonding time. But that day, in 1990, was unlike any other. The mist was thicker than usual, blanketing the river and the surrounding woods. Now, the blind, their makeshift shelter, was the only place they felt somewhat safe. And the father remembers how scared he was when his son was shaking him awake. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands trembling on his shoulder. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. "It's back." Now the father strained his ears and sure enough, he could hear it. The sound of something very large moving through the underbrush, snapping everything under its tremendous weight. It was closer than before and it was now moving fast. The ground beneath them trembled with every heavy step they could hear, and whatever it was now getting very close. Now, he had heard of strange things going on in Fraser Canyon, but this was completely different because growing up, he had always dismissed them as folklore and tales that others would share to outsiders. But now him and his son were sitting in this blind, listening, just listening, and they could hear this growling and grunting outside. Whatever it was let out a scream, and it made their blood run cold. It wasn't just a sound of a shriek or a scream, but something of pure rage, warning them that they were in territory that was not theirs. The man's son was in tears, clutching onto his father for dear life. All the father could do was just hold him and hold him close as he's thinking and his mind is racing for a plan. But whatever had let out that screech very close to their deer stand had now quickly disappeared, and the forest around them fell completely silent. In fact, the only sound you you could hear was the soft lapping of the river against the shore. And they didn't dare move or breathe until they were sure that whatever had made this noise was completely gone. And so that was the last time they would ever go hunting in Fraser Canyon. And they would not speak of that day, but the memory would haunt both of them. Now, this canyon isn't exclusive to strange creatures. In fact, there are a lot of weird energies and hauntings all around the canyon nestled within this place called Hell's Gate. It's this super narrow passageway between the towering rock walls of Fraser Canyon. So just imagine the canyon walls rising about 1,000 meters or 3,300 feet above the river. But even though it is such an ominous name, Hell's Gate is a very touristy hotspot. People traveling the Gold Rush Trail can enjoy their air tram ride through the canyon, taking in all its beauty. But here's the thing, this place is said to be crawling with ghosts and angry spirits. Now, this airstream has attracted some strange spooks. There's this gift shop, and people often report seeing the spirit of a small woman wearing a bonnet and an old-fashioned blue dress hanging around. But it doesn't stop there. They say that you can also catch the smell of fresh apple pie when she's about. A ghost who enjoys baking, imagine that. Then there's other ghosts. An Asian man who's usually seen on the deck. Some say he's the spirit of a Chinese immigrant worker who had died during the gold rush era. And there's also this sad, lonely little girl that sometimes wanders around the halls of the upper terminal. But it gets even stranger. In the restaurant, you might spot a ghostly man just leisurely smoking a cigar in the far corner. And perhaps the eeriest of all, there's a dark and shadowy figure that's seen lurking below the deck near the gold panning station, and he's got these two red-eyed dogs on a leash. Pretty creepy. Not to mention the dead, restless spirits of the miners who still wander the area. And Hell's Gate is so devilishly treacherous that it boasts its body count. Its turbulent waters, forced through a channel of only 110 feet wide, have claimed the lives of countless people. In fact, in the early 20th century, when railroad construction inadvertently led to rock slides that blocked the natural passage of migrating salmon, millions of fish perished trying to cross the severe bottleneck in Fraser River, sparking an ecological crisis of apocalyptic proportions. But the dark past of Hell's Gate doesn't end there. Some say that its malevolent energy extends beyond the physical realm into the paranormal, if you believe in such things. Now let's dive into some of those terrifying encounters. There's a local legend often talked about among area residents, and they tell of the infamous Hell's Gate Poltergeist. A supposed demonic spirit allegedly torments victims, particularly those who work and visit the nearby Hell's Gate air tram. Reports of objects moving seemingly independently and ghostly apparitions lurking at the edge of one's vision are all eerily familiar. In fact, one tram operator recalls discovering a raven's lifeless, mangled body lying on the floor of an electrical room. After disposing of the carcass, the operator seized by an unexplainable feeling of dread. Throughout the night, they became plagued by strange, violent nightmares. Many believe that the spirit of that wretched bird may have sought vengeance on the tram operator for disturbing the delicate balance at the threshold of Hell's Gate. Now, Ed, a local man, had his own bizarre experience while near Hell's Gate. Now, Ed had never been one to put pen to paper, but after what he had seen, he would feel compelled to share his story. Now, of course, he was no stranger to the unusual, but what he encountered that night in 2009 near Hell's Gate was beyond anything he could have imagined. He had always been a rather rational man, a firm believer in what could be seen and touched, but he was about to be shaken to the core, because Hell's Gate, a narrow gorge in the Fraser River, was a place Ed knew quite well. He had spent countless summers there as a child, fishing with his father, listening to his father's tales of strange happenings. Now, his father always had a penchant for the supernatural, a trait Ed never inherited until that night, he claims. So it was a typical summer evening. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant sound of the rivers, and Ed was busy driving back from a friend's place, the road ahead illuminated only by the faint glow of his headlights. And as he rounded a bend, the headlights caught something in the middle of the road. At first, Ed thought it was a bear, but as he slowed down, he realized it was something else entirely. It was a creature with a massive body covered covered in dark, matted, mangy, disgusting fur. He described the shoulders as broad and muscular with pointed ears, but not unlike a German shepherd. But what struck Ed the most were its hands. They were almost human-like, clutching what appeared to be a dead rabbit. In fact, he would describe the hands being very similar to that of a raccoon, and immediately he could feel full body paralysis as he's trying to watch and process what's going on, his mind struggling to make sense. And this thing was standing perfectly still. It lifts up its head and it responds to him, looking in his direction. Instinctively, Ed then flicks on the high beams and it lights up the creature's orangey fiery eyes. But in the harsh light, it would slowly rise up its arm to shield its eyes from the bright light. But the intensity that burned within this being's eyes almost seemed demonic. And this was when it got worse, because as it's shielding its eyes, the thing fully stands erect, and now Ed is terrifying seeing its unnatural movements. It acted awkward and disjointed and uncoordinated, and Ed recalls hearing this wet popping sound as it stood up on its hind legs, and then it charges at his vehicle. Out of sheer reaction, Ed floors the accelerator, turns his car, and swerves it, almost going right into the woods. The creature veers past his car, and Ed floors it. He doesn't stop driving until he reaches his cabins. His hands are shaking. His breathing's out of control. He didn't sleep at all that night. He can barely process what was happening. He had nightmares for days afterwards, and it wasn't until a couple of days later that he tried to confide in a close friend who clearly dismissed it as he was just tired, he was exhausted, he clearly saw a bear, but I mean guys, come on. For those of us that have seen bear and know what bear look like, this was not a bear. It was something that defied explanation. And it's been many years since this happened, and so he's kind of just kept it under wraps and not really wanted to talk about it. Now, Ed knew that Hell's Gate has always been a place of supernatural mystery with all the strange things that happened, and so he's really not surprised that he would have a sighting like that near this area where he believes there's other strange things going on. Now, why does all of this seem to be so attached to Hell's Gate? Well, it's tough to say, but that's not the only haunted place in the entire region. There's also this lake nestled between three mountains near Foster's Bar, and people claim that these strangest things also happen there. This eerie place, ladies and gentlemen, is known as Devil's Lake, and it is believed to be full of powerful spirits, according to the legends passed down by generations of natives. As a result, they've always been cautious when passing by the lake, and even today, they continue the ritual of blackening their faces to avoid being recognized by the devil said to be lurking in the lake. But that's not all, because the tales go on about herds of goats transforming into stone young maidens meeting their untimely deaths while swimming, and get this, a bull with a dog on its head attempting to swim across the lake, vanishing halfway without a trace. What adds to the overall fear surrounding Devil's Lake is the Lillooet tribe's tradition of an ancient evil woman believed to reside at the lake. With long, eerie hair, she is known to float around on a log, chanting, singing songs that nobody understands, and to avoid being spotted by this demonic entity, people would cover any exposed skin with ash as they pass by the lake. Now, legend has it that anyone, or any creature for that matter, who dares to enter the waters of the Devil's Lake vanishes. Although this evil older woman is said to dwell within the lake, she's also known to wander the land, searching for souls to prey upon. People have also reported seeing strange canine humanoid creatures, among other things. It's evident that by all of these tales of strangeness, there is surely something about this canyon. Is there a supernatural energy surrounding it, much like something like Skinwalker Ranch, or is there something else going on that deals with the very fabric of our reality? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Not to mention, if you're a fan of storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural, be sure to go ahead and smack that subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.